home to 129 million residents. México es una tierra hermosa, llena de cultura y historia.
En el canto de las olas encontré un rumor de luz.
But today we're not going to be talking about Mexican musicians or Mexican football. The year is 1876. Porfirio Diaz is the president, but what the people of Mexico didn't know yet was that they were about to find out that he would hold the accurate title of a dictator. He was all around hated and accused of rigging elections to his favor, and following and applying policies that really only benefited and favored the upper class, while the lower class were left suffering in poverty. This created a huge gap and tension between the classes that would come into play later on.
Well, you're still yellow. You know what else is yellow?
What?
You are.
Yeah? Well, it doesn't matter what you call me, because I never want to see you again anyway. Tartar sauce.
During his 34-year run, he made efforts to industrialize and westernize Mexico, as well as introduce foreign investments, which caused quite the controversy throughout the people of Mexico.
There goes Latin America, becoming independent in the Latin American Wars of Independence. Britain just figured out how to turn steam into power, so now they can make many different types of machines and factories with machines in them, so they can make a lot of products real fast. Then they invent some trains.
However, there were some highlights from his time. He managed to push for the construction of factories, railroads, dams, telegraph lines, oil extraction, and mining. However, one main issue still remained untouched, and it was the prominent social oppression of the lower class. In other words, the people remained poor, but now at an even more extreme level, and with more public awareness of it. With Diaz's new land reform in place in 1910, the government seized vast amounts of farmland for governmental use. With less plantation and harvest available, Mexico went into a famine. Under Diaz's rule, people had no other choice but to work like slaves on the land that was taken from them under his land reform and hacienda system.
Okay, so today we're gonna be making Mexico. Start with some good US control. Don't use too much though. Oh no. Oh God. Okay. Good food. Okay. Smells like some good Mexico up in here. Next ingredient. Haciendas. Now be really careful not to pour too. Oh no! Okay. Okay, so now we have a lot of haciendas in it. It's gonna be really good Mexico. Our next ingredient is peasant relief. Now, normally in the original recipe they tell you to add a lot, but I really don't like peasant relief, so that goes right in the sink. Okay, wait. Now you just gotta stir it up. Look at that mixture. That's a great Mexico if I've ever seen one. Okay. Wait, what is this? That's really good.
People were mad, hungry, and exhausted, and soon enough, people decided to put their foot down because they've had enough. The 1900s was a time of societal awakening in Mexico as the public started to recognize their own fundamental rights. Mexican women of the 1900s advocated to shape working conditions and politics. Although women's employment nationwide declined during the 1890s through 1930s, this was still considered a significant moment in cultural change because women were finally getting recognition for their own work. Women of that time also focused around the issues of maternity leave, equal pay for equal work, and respect for seniority. Two names to remember are Francisco Villa, also known as Pancho. He came from the north side of Mexico, and Emiliano Zapata, who was from the south part of Mexico. And together they played important roles in establishing democracy and overthrowing dictator Diaz. Other information to know is that the revolution started in a town called Dolores, which is near Guanajuato, Mexico. Here's a general overview of the Mexican Revolution on a map. This revolution lasted about a decade. Most people like to say that it lasted more than that, and there's still a debate over the official end date of the revolution, but I think it's pretty safe to say that it was approximately a decade long. Anyways, back to the map. On the bottom here, you see all the different colors that represent sort of the main leaders of this revolution and the different routes that they took during this revolution. And as you can see, there's really no overlap between their routes. So that means they're pretty, spread out. Anyways, the orange, darker shaded region of the map represents the general area of where the revolution took place. And as you can see, there's some places that I mentioned before, like Guanajuato, but there's also some new ones like Chihuahua, Coahuila, Durango, Zacatecas. Overall, this is what the Mexican Revolution looked like. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about the Mexican Revolution, let's talk about their goals. So 3 out of the 4 I have listed here were actually successfully permanent and completed. The first one being overthrowing their current dictator. Yes, they accomplished that. Next is fair working conditions, and this happened when the Mexicans were treated as slaves in poor working conditions. And here we have basic human rights, which would be like freedom of speech or the pursuit of happiness. And last but not least, we have implementing democracy. And this is definitely a goal that they didn't successfully and fully achieve, permanently at least. Technically, it's considered a democracy, but by definition, Mexico is still not a true democracy to this day. With that in mind, another question that does come up an awful lot is, was the Mexican Revolution actually successful? And my answer is that that's a hard question to determine in general, just considering that there's so many factors and so many variables that weigh in to the Mexican Revolution. The revolution could be considered unsuccessful due to the quantity of deaths, how many people had to risk their lives, how many people sacrificed their lives. However, in terms of success, everyone has their own definition of what success truly is. But with its run, the Mexican Revolution maintained stable overall. It breeded a new political generation in Mexico, as well as caused a significant impact on Mexico's future and current state right now. But in the words of Alan Knight himself, he suggests, what if the revolution never happened? When I think of modern day comparisons or modern day connections to the revolution, the first thing that comes to my mind is Guatemala, my home country. They have the biggest economy in Central America, yet they still somehow manage to have one of the highest inequality rates in Latin America. there's just this big divide and gap between the upper and lower class, just like what we saw in the Mexican Revolution. They have the worst poverty, malnutrition, and maternal child mortality rates in the region, especially in rural and indigenous areas. They also just have a bad history and bad luck with presidents that have records of stealing money and lying to the public, as politicians do. The World Bank Study Poverty Assessment in Guatemala reported that poverty rose to 59.3% from its previous 53% in 2014. The next years are Guatemala has an opportunity to reduce their poverty through more rapid economic growth, while pro-poor policy reforms, like the people of Mexico in the revolution wanted, could result in significant improvements, rising growth will be important to achieve the country's medium and long-term social goals, just like what they wanted in the Mexican Revolution by the public people. Public investment, just like foreign investment that was advocated by President Diaz at the time in the revolution, is essential to achieving Guatemala's development goals, but the idea isn't taken seriously because they have a lack of resources. Additionally, the government collects the lowest share of public revenues in the world relative to the size of its economy.
We're no strangers to assassination.
You've been killed, so have I! A full seizing of land's what I'm thinking of. You wouldn't get this from any other guy. I just wanna tell you how I'm feeling. Gotta make you understand. Never gonna give you my reign.
Never gonna not revolt.
Never gonna let you run for president. Never gonna give peasants relief.
Never gonna go to jail. Never gonna sit in jail and not write the San Luis Potosi.